young, gifted alchemist. One who doesn't use transmutation circles, and who has an auto-mail right arm. I know you. You are the Full Metal Alchemist, Edward ELRIC.
Edward ELRIC is a technical main character of the two anime series, Full Metal Alchemist and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and is also part of two anime movies, Conquer Shambhala and Stir of Milison. Like most technical character profiles like I've done before, I would usually go into his background, his fighting style, his favorite hobby, and his favorite color, and I'm deciding to change it up some and take a look at more who the character is, their motivations, and what makes them who they are. I'm still going to probably go over some of these categories, but more in depth. But nonetheless, I do have to go into his background some, because, well, in order to understand a character fully, you'll need to know where they started. Edward ELRIC grew up with his younger brother Alphonse and their parents Hohenheim and Trisha ELRIC in a town called Risenbourg, a nice little village in the country of Amestris, a country that has been in multiple wars since nearly its inception, until one day when their father left for unknown reasons, and that left their mom to take care of him. But luckily Edward and Alphonse had a knack for alchemy, which is, I guess, the form of magical power in this universe, that allows you to transform objects in almost anything as long as you follow the rule of equivalent exchange, where you must give up as much as you receive. But one thing that was a taboo amongst alchemists is the use of alchemy to bring back the dead. And sadly, one day, due to plague that swept across the country, their mother died. This leaving Ed and Al to live with the family friends, the Rockbells. But over time, Ed and Al wanted to learn more about alchemy so that they could bring back their mother, and they sought out a teacher, and they happened to find one who happened to be a little blunt, but nonetheless they learned and became stronger. And then one day they decided it was time to attempt to bring back their mother, knowing fully well that this was taboo. In attempting to do this, it rebounded. Edward lost his leg and Alphonse lost his whole body, but thanks to Edward's quick thinking, he bonded Alphonse's soul to a piece of armor, but Edward giving up his arm in order to do so. And after that horrific event, Edward joins the military in order to gain material in order to find or create the mysterious Philosopher's Stone that is rumored to break the boundaries of alchemy, and they would then use that to get their old bodies back. And now that we're done indulging in the background, now let's take a look at what actually makes the character Edward ELRIC tick. Like I said a minute ago, Edward and Alphonse love to learn. It is almost second nature to them. It's not just because of the fact that they lost their bodies, and now they want to do tons of research like it's homework or something. They've been bookworms since they were kids. And with this drive, you can see how they would come across alchemy. But they didn't just happen to fall upon alchemy by accident. Hohenheim, their father, knew how to do alchemy, and pretty well. And of course, as children, they are going to look up to their father as a higher figure, and the fact that most kids pick up on habits that are around them, and then they try to imitate them, this led to their curiosity of alchemy. Then also, their mother was a quintessential part of this, being the person that Ed and Al looked up to the most for approval. And her approval of this alchemy gave them the drive they needed to get better and learn more about it. And even though they did love knowledge and alchemy, it doesn't mean that you should take these things to the extreme, because even knowledge and power can't fix everything in the world, especially when it comes to death. And the ELRICs find this out the hardest ways, in trying to bring back that one person that approved of them in their alchemy the most. And after this failure, we get to see a great shift in the once upbeat happy child. A shift that will shape the character you see in the rest of the show. And this is a kid with motivation, but more of one who understands that he is not a god. And knowledge can't bring you everything, and it created a form of helplessness inside Edward that we see multiple times, especially later on with the death of Nina, a small girl who is used by her dad to create a creature called a chimera. And the helplessness that we see from Edward and having no way of saving her, we get a sense that one of his biggest aspects to his character may partly be a facade. And that's his arrogance, which is a trait that can be said to be formed over time, having to act as a replacement for their father, and also having a prodigal-like talent with alchemy can also build up one's arrogance. And Edward's arrogance really shines in two different areas. One, the first time that he ever met Rose, he basically talked down to her and about her religion, about everything being scientific and can be solved with alchemy or science. And then the entirety of him trying to bring back his mother is his basic arrogance and not understanding also, and his belief that he could actually bring back a living being. But this arrogance is somewhat halted when seeing these points in time where he can't do anything to fix certain situations. This is also an aspect that keeps Edward from being an atheist. Over the period of the show, we see Edward say that he is agnostic, in which he doesn't have a belief or disbelief in a god, because like the show shows a few times, he is mesmerized by the creation of life, shown largely when he sees the birth of a child, and he says it's something that no alchemist has ever done, and with this one thought, it creates a sense of why he is agnostic, because he might have no way of proving God doesn't exist, or does, but the creation of life is something that even he can't comprehend. So it's something it would seem he wouldn't be surprised by if there was a God. Also the fact that he has gone through the portal of truth, which is a door that opens, and opened when Ed and Al brought back their mother, and each person that goes through this portal, each have a giant door, and then there is a being called Truth, which could be called the god of this world, which takes somewhat form of the person that has entered. But back to this giant door. At first glance, it looks like some colossal floating door in the middle of white nothingness with creepy eyes and very feely hands inside. But looking at the doors of each person, we see that there is some sort of pattern or writing on it. And this writing is actually a representation of the person and the beliefs that they have, but also their form of alchemy that they use, and their gateway from the real world to this other dimension. For example, when we see Alphonse's door, his door shows the work of George Ripley's, a 15th century alchemist, and his work, The Marvel of Alchemy, which gives a look into the findings of the philosopher elixirs. Then there is Mustang's door, which is alchemy writings of his flame alchemy, and then the first door that we ever see is Edward's, which is a representation of the Sephirotic Tree of Life as depicted by Robert Flood, which is a tree that can be seen or represented as a depiction of God or the human body. And this represents Edward pretty well, being amazed by the human body and maybe even God itself and the creation of things. But let's get back to reality. Something that you would think about most kids is, what if they get scolded for doing something bad? They would then probably avoid doing that same thing again. But well, screw that. Most kids don't listen and keep doing that same thing again and again because they are ignorant kids. In this case, it represents Edward and Alphonse even after losing their mother to alchemy. They keep using it, whether it be ignorance, stubbornness, or the want to try to fix their problems that they created for themselves, or maybe it's all three. But for Edward, it's a little more than wanting to get his arm back. It's about getting this guilt and weight off his chest of putting his brother in a suit of armor where he can't feel or eat or sleep ever. And also with him being the older brother that he is supposed to look after him. And this pain that he has caused his brother has killed a lot of Edward's pride, and he constantly feels this worry for a while whether Al blamed him for putting him in this armor and what happened to the both of them. Soon we found out that Alphonse doesn't blame him and accepts that it is as much his fault as it is Edward's, but this still takes a toll on his pride. And past looking at his motivations for trying to look for a way to get their bodies back, we see a plethora of other characteristics from Edward, and that can largely be traced back to their old man Hohenheim. But let's start with Edward's also fun hot-headedness. In many different shows, or largely anime, the main character is a lot of the time a hot-headed kid who doesn't listen to anything or anyone and does things because they want to complete a certain goal that they have placed out for themselves. And at first glance, Edward Elric fits all these stereotypes to a T. But as you watch the show, we may see times that he goes off the rails and gets mad at something. Those are the only real times that we see the anger get the better of him, which is whenever somebody makes fun of him. For the most part, when it comes to different situations, he doesn't run blindly into them. And he is a very smart kid who's able to plan things out and then go through with the plans that they make. But it's not to say that he doesn't get triggered in the middle of battle. He does. He gets angry a lot, especially when Envy calls him Pipsqueak. But his anger and actions during these periods have rarely a large-term effect on their plan. And this hatred or hot-headedness can all be boiled down to, like I said, his hatred for his father. Because back when he was a kid and his mother was alive, Edward's character was a lot calmer, and you can see this in his facial expression seeming to be more prone to listening to others. Later scenes, when they were living with the Rockbells, we see that he is a lot more upfront, blunt, and harsh about things. And this could be brought up to his anger about his mother's death, and then this turning to blaming his dad. And anytime his father is pretty much brought up, he always has a sort of resentment toward him and anger. This also leads to Edward's apparent hate for authority and being told what to do, being the large reason Edward shows dislike towards Mustang to an extent, because whenever Edward meets with Mustang, he always has a snarky remark or acts sort of nonchalant, having this not much of a care attitude when talking to him. Also, Mustang's height and also just authority's height in general, it could be a form of jealousy from Edward, because for the most part, most forms of authority to Edward are taller than him. In most forms of media, height is a sign of power and authority, shown by the show, since Edward is really known for being short, and it turns out he doesn't have much of authority to these other higher ups. Yet, even though he is technically a major, he doesn't act like an authority figure over people that are lower than him in the military. Yet, with this resentment, we do see that he does respect the higher ups, such as when it comes to meeting King Bradley at the beginning and also to their teacher Azumi. But they still have no problem going against authority at times in order to complete their own goal. Like I said earlier, a lot of the drive that Edward has comes from his want to fix his own problems and also fix the guilt that he also has. Thing is, a lot of this drive and want to fix these problems are ultimately triggered by the death of another. And death is something that has plagued the show through the genocide of an entire race to the death of the many characters close to Edward. But there is another death that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the death of Mays Hughes. However, a short time he was around, he did act as sort of a father figure to Ed and Al. And no matter how much he seemed to annoy Ed, Ed did care for him. But his death brought hesitation into Edward's head, the hesitation of letting others to help in his goals, because Mays died trying to help Ed in the end. Yet, even with this hesitation, people still came to help, but Ed still didn't want anyone else to get hurt. But past all these deaths at the beginning of the show, we soon get to the Philosopher's Stone, where they find out that the stone is made of humans, and being the very moral kids that they are, they didn't want to use the lives of innocent people to fix a problem that they created. Later in the show, we see Edward face off against the true form of the homunculus Envy. And well, it turns out that Envy is made of the souls that make up the Philosopher's Stone. And when facing this beast, and when Edward's seeing these souls, he becomes practically paralyzed at the sight and hearing the voice of someone that sounds like Nina.
Let's play.
Which shows the stain of her death that still follows him. And in this event, we see that he'd rather die than have to kill these beings, even if they aren't actual people. And this is probably the best example in the show that shows his overall attempt at avoiding killing innocent people. And a lot of this can be somewhat prone to their younger mentality, that they don't want to kill even though their life is on the line. And also the irony of him being part of the military and their entire country going through a genocide of a race, yet Edward still fights for them. It's also good to note it's not because of his loyalty to the country that he keeps fighting for them, but it's to have access to resources that come with it. And even though he is supposed to be a military dog, he usually avoids killing even when commanded to by his superiors, especially if they are innocent, and this is based on their moralistic views in the forms of deaths that they've seen earlier, but also being naive children that thinking that everything can be done without killing of others. As seen and brought up a lot in the show, Edward doesn't like to be called short. It is a long time running gag, and also an actual plot point relating Alphonse's body sucking up all his energy, basically, and then is also something to do with his growth as a person from the start of the show to the end. So at the beginning, he is a very small kid, and at the beginning of the show, he is the second shortest, but during most of the show, he is the shortest of the three main characters, and by the end of the show, he is the same height as Al, and also taller than Winry. But what might have sparked all this growth? Did he start drinking milk? Did he hit a growth spurt? Did he inject steroids? Well, other than the last one, those might be the actual reasons, but it is also just a portrayal and shown growth of his own self. And it can be argued that over the show, he didn't have the most character development from start to finish, but he did take many steps of growth as a human. From forgiving his father, learning that he doesn't have to rely on himself all the time, understanding that being a normal human is perfectly fine, the accepting that he can compromise with others rather than having his negotiations always have to follow what he wants, aka stubbornness. Edward overcoming his own pride is also represented by his defeat of Pride the homunculus in the show, and then his confession to Winry. And with these, we see his growth more as a human being rather than a character in a show. Edward's overall look, well, I know it's easy to see, but he has blonde hair and a braid, golden eyes, a red coat with an alchemy symbol on it, black boots, pants, and a jacket. And with looking at his golden hair and eyes, this correlates to Edward's father, where they both, at one time, looked very similar. well, their teenage selves. And also Alphonse has blonde hair and gold eyes too. Gold can be seen as a representation of the divine, wisdom, or the attainment of the Philosopher's Stone. And in this case, it could represent like a being like Jesus. Especially looking at Hohenheim, who lived his life walking and soon made his way to Xing, where he spread knowledge of alchemy, and this can correlate to Jesus, who spent his life spreading knowledge in the beliefs and also creating miracles. And the people of Xing later saw this man, Hohenheim, as a near god, giving him the name of the philosopher of the West. And this does all correlate back to Edward, because both Alphonse and Edward at the end of the show do travel to different sides of the world, and even though they did go to learn, they surely spread their knowledge that they learned to the world too. And also through times creating things and fixing things, this could be viewed as miracles with alchemy. Yes, I know a lot of people did alchemy in the show, but a lot of the times that we see Edward actually fixing things for other people. Edward's coat, on the other hand, is red and contains the FMAB symbol, which represents his tutelage to his teacher Izumi. And over the show, he says he wears it because it looks cool, but he usually takes it off because it either gets destroyed and it gets in his way, or he takes it off when he doesn't care whether somebody knows about his arm. And he may subconsciously want to hide it, or hide his arm to hide the guilt he has for having to lose it to put his brother in the suit of armor. And also the color red usually signifies an intense passion, anger, or adventure, which can easily describe the hot-headed adventurer taking Edward. And he also has, of course, his automail arm and leg, and each character that lost something or was trying to bring someone back to life, each lost a part of their body, and for Edward's sake, he lost his leg, and then Mustang lost his eyesight, and this kind of represents a part of their character in some way, such as Mustang saw a better vision for the future, so he lost his sight, and for here, Edward lost his leg, and he's a character that wants to move forward with his life on his own 2 feet, so he lost his leg. He also has a military pocket watch, signifying his connection to the military and also being a military dog, to where he is bound to whatever the military does. And he engraved the date in which he left home and burned down their old house and the watch, which he says it signifies their vow to not go back. But Hohenheim points out that he burnt down his house to hide the memory of what they had done to their mother. This is something that a lot of people in real life do. They say they have certain meaning for different things just to give it a reason, but are really trying to hide the true meaning for it inside. Because people don't like facing the truth at times. This could be also represented by the placement of the date inside the watch, hiding it from view and making it hard to open, because this is his attempt to hide the true reason. And to finish off, there are some characters, in this case 3, that I felt have an overall abundance of importance to making Edward who he was. And I know I don't mention his mother here, but I felt like I already went over many of the focal points for her meaning to him earlier. But a look at another strong female who has a positive impact on Edward is Edward's waifu, Winry. And being his waifu is a very small part of what she does for the main character and who she is. She can be seen as a support for him, as helping to repair his automail, but to also help keep his head straight and focused, and also a motivation to protect her and the other people that he cares about. And she is also a constant reminder of that for him, and also a reminder of home and someone that is a source of family. For her entire character, she is a symbol of someone who creates and protects life in its whole, seen from her parents being doctors, her help to fix the parts of Edward emotionally and physically, also the time that she helped give birth to a baby, and then her giving birth to assuming Edward's children. And in the end, we do see that they end up together, but this last scene between them can show us how awkward Edward can be around girls, and just awkward in general, which is a funny and I'll bet geeky scene. It helped to give us a sense of how much Edward has grown, and also how much he still is sort of an awkward teen too. The next one should be of no surprise. Alphonse is Edward's younger brother, and in the case of their mother dying and father leaving, Edward had to somewhat take the place of their parent, and Edward leads both of them and looks out for Alphonse. And even when their parents were around, we see that he still looked after and guided his brother. But Alphonse is actually the more stable and calm-minded of the two. He is there a lot of the time to calm Edward down when he starts to get a little hot-headed. And Alphonse is sort of a check to Edward. Alphonse also acts as motivation to Edward in helping him to move on and move past things, and also to keep him from dying. And also his presence being a reminder of what happened, and Edward wanting to get his brother's body back. As a pair, they resemble the trope of the giant and the smaller characters such as Timon and Pumbaa or Groot and Rocket. and in general they work in tandem with each other, getting along and looking out for each other, even though we do see some chinks in the armor, no pun intended, at times when Alphonse believed that he might have been completely made up by Edward. You can also sense a form of jealousy in Edward whenever he fought Alphonse, especially when Alphonse got the ability to use clapping transmutation. But to the end, Edward never gives up on his brother and fights to the end and finally gets back his body, even though Edward had to give up his alchemy to do so, but this shows how much he cares and loves his brother. And lastly, Hohenheim. I know I've already mentioned him a lot, but I felt that there's more than just the negatives that helped to form Edward's character. And even though we know how much Hohenheim cares for his family, he had to make a decision that in Edward's eyes was a betrayal to his family, and in leaving. And then later, their mom dies, and he is nowhere to be found. And this leads to Edward's resentment of him, and like I said earlier, creates his dislike of authority and many other attributes. But even though Edward, throughout most of the show, scolds him and seems to really hate him, Edward never sees him as an enemy, but the use of their mother's maiden name, ELRIC, can show that he still doesn't count him as part of the family, but more of an acquaintance who Edward despises. Edward does seem to understand after a period that he did care for his mother, and near the end of the show that he loved his whole family, and Edward finally calls him dad when he was going to sacrifice himself to save his brother, even though he did happen to swear along with it. This acknowledgement shows Edward's growth and also Hohenheim's relief of somewhat having his son's approval and being called part of the family once again. This relationship is probably the strongest, whether bad or good, because of how much it actually shapes Edward Elric as a whole. So to finish this off, Edward Elric may at face value look like a generic shonen MC who has a hot-headed temper, but if you look deeper, he is a character who is very kind at heart, but gives in under the pressure of losing someone he cares about the most, and goes to extremes to try to get them back, and he ends up paying for his arrogance. But instead of giving up and blaming others for his own mistakes, he takes up for them, and goes to face the world, and even a god, and in the end understands that he has to compromise, and that he doesn't have to shoulder the pain that he has put on himself, and ends up getting his brother back in his life. He also confesses his true feelings to Winry, and lastly comes to terms with his dad. And that is a character that we came to know in the series, the one with the heart made of full metal. Edward Elric.
Sacrifices are necessary. You can't gain anything without losing something first. Although, if you can endure that pain and walk away from it, you'll find that you now have a heart strong enough to overcome any obstacle. Yeah. A heart made full metal.